At 4:32 in the bitter evening of February 5, 1944, near the village of Lysianka in central Ukraine, the M4A2 Sherman stood exposed on a low ridge, its diesel engine coughing once, then falling dead. The cold air burned at -18 degrees. German panzer grenadiers were advancing through the trees below, and somewhere behind them, a PaK-40 anti-tank gun was being dragged into position. Inside the tank, the crew stared at the lifeless tachometer while the mechanic whispered that if the diesel froze again, they would not restart it. The commander hesitated, looked at the ice forming along the fuel lines, and asked quietly, as shells began to fall around them, "How did this happen?" To understand that moment, we have to go backward, 2 weeks, 2 missions, and one unorthodox idea earlier. The Red Army's 1st Guards Tank Army had been pushing west toward the Korsun-Shevchenkivsky pocket. Stalin had ordered pressure across the line, and the Soviets intended to close the encirclement with armor, infantry, and artillery coordinated in relentless waves. American-built M4A2 Shermans, powered by twin General Motors diesel engines, had been assigned to the 3rd Guards Tank Corps for reliability and range. But diesel behaved differently in winter. In extreme cold, Soviet crews learned that the thick fuel could gel inside lines and pumps, robbing engines of pressure. The Germans knew this too. They laughed when captured Shermans stalled in the frost, calling them tractor tanks, saying diesel belonged in farm equipment, not war. This mission made the problem deadly. The unit needed mobility across frozen fields and shallow river crossings. Delays meant giving the Wehrmacht time to build ambush positions. Every stalled tank became a beacon to German artillery. In the 3rd Guards Tank Corps, there served a quiet, methodical mechanic named Senior Sergeant Mikhail Sokolov. He had worked in a textile factory before the war, repairing heavy looms with meager tools. Diesel intimidated most men. It intimidated him as well, not because he did not understand it, but because he knew too well what happened when diesel thickened or air entered the system. Engines did not just stall, they died at the worst possible moment. He had watched one M4A2 freeze during drills near Bila Tserkva. The fuel pump seized. The starter drained the batteries. The Germans shelled the position, and the crew abandoned it. For days afterward, he replayed the failure. Diesel was not the enemy. Cold was. And cold obeyed physics more than fear. So when new orders arrived in late January, pushing the Corps toward the Niloy Tikich River, he inspected every Sherman as though they were his responsibility alone. He drained sumps, checked lines, cleaned filters, and heated components using blowtorches controlled with caution. But still he worried. The pump housing on his assigned tank carried hairline scratches, microscopic channels where ice could form. He warned the commander, Captain Leonid Beryak, that the diesel system would betray them if the temperature dropped suddenly. Beryak listened because he had learned the hard way that mechanics were not servants, they were guardians. He asked only one question: what can we do? The answer did not exist in manuals. On February 3rd, as the Corps advanced slowly through frozen fields and narrow lanes bordered by bare trees, the first true sign of trouble appeared. The Sherman lurched, slowed, and coughed. The tachometer fluttered. Sokolov heard the change in tone instantly, not ignition failure, not oil starvation. It was starvation of fuel. He ordered the driver to idle. The engine stumbled like a man suffocating. He opened the armored engine deck. Winter air sliced into the cavity. He traced the metal fuel lines with his bare glove until he felt the one section colder than the rest, tight and brittle. Diesel did not flow. The pump fought against a half-solid mass. He knew that if he let the engine stop, restarting would drain the batteries and invite German attention. Around them, the landscape felt abandoned. Snow lay unevenly. Tracks cut frozen scars into the ground. The sky had flattened into dull steel. Somewhere to the west, artillery rumbled. It would have been simple to blame the equipment. But the mission demanded mobility, and the Corps depended on coordination. A disabled Sherman broke the rhythm of attack. If they stalled now, supply trucks would bottleneck, infantry would lose support, and the Germans might counterattack. That is why this particular failure mattered. He clenched his jaw and decided the usual warm water trick was too slow. The pump had to be protected permanently, not rescued repeatedly. But Soviet doctrine warned against experimental modifications under combat. Still, he reasoned, Soviet doctrine also favored initiative when survival demanded it. That night, they bivouacked in a shallow depression among willows. Temperatures dropped further. Crews huddled under tarps and tried to rest. Sokolov did not sleep. He studied the diesel, replaying every pipe, gasket, and bracket in memory. The Americans had designed the M4A2 for temperate climates. The Soviets used them in climates that punished metal. He remembered industrial tricks from the textile factory, insulating feed pipes, diverting warm air, borrowing heat from friction. Near midnight, while frost thickened on the hull, he formed an idea both simple and dangerous. If diesel froze because it lost heat, then he would give it heat, not from torches, not from open flames, but from the engine itself. The Sherman expelled warm air around its radiator and exhaust manifold. If he could redirect that warmth toward the fuel pump and lines, they could prevent gelling altogether. But redirecting warmth inside a tank filled with flammable liquids was madness if done clumsily. He scrounged scrap metal from a destroyed T-34, shaping a curved shroud like a crude funnel. He cut strips from an old felt greatcoat and wrapped sections of the fuel line as insulation. Then he anchored the shroud so that hot air, once the engine ran, would bathe the pump housing gently rather than scorch it. He tested the airflow with his gloved hand. The commander watched in silence. He understood the risk. If the modification trapped fumes or overheated wiring, the tank could burn. He asked whether Sokolov was sure. The mechanic did not answer with certainty. He answered with necessity. By dawn, the temperature climbed slightly. The Sherman started with difficulty, but it started. Warm air flowed through the improvised duct. Diesel softened. Pressure normalized. On the map, arrows indicated movement toward the encirclement line. Orders arrived to advance. The Germans would not learn about the trick yet, not until 2 days later, when the Corps crested the ridge near Lysianka and found itself under observation. They saw only the Sherman leading its platoon, diesel humming, exhaust breathing white clouds across the frozen field. And then the Pak-40 opened fire. The first shell struck short, sending frozen earth upward. The second clipped a tree. The commander ordered forward movement. The driver throttled. The engine surged, then stumbled. A brief cough. A tremor. The same pump threatened to betray them as the Germans closed in, convinced that diesel would freeze again, leaving the tank helpless. Inside, Sokolov stared at the gauges, feeling the familiar dread rise. The innovation would either hold, or condemn them. The gauge needle dipped, trembled, then steadied again. The improvised shroud rattled with vibration. The German gun crew adjusted their aim with methodical precision, working as they had been trained since before the war: find the target, fix it in place, then destroy it. They had learned on the Eastern Front that Soviet armor often stalled in winter. Diesel, they believed, betrayed machines under frost. They trusted that belief more than the icy breath on their faces. The Sherman lurched ahead. Snow cracked beneath the tracks. The driver's knuckles whitened on the levers. The commander watched the distant hedge line where the Pak-40 hid, camouflage netting fluttering faintly. Somewhere behind it, panzer grenadiers crouched with panzerfausts and rifles, waiting for the tank to slow or stall. Inside the engine bay, heat began to build. Air moved through the scrap metal funnel, sliding across the pump housing. Sokolov listened more than he looked. He listened for the thin whine of the pump regaining rhythm, for the deeper tone of synchronized combustion. He knew that if gelling returned, the engine would stutter again, and this time they would not have space to repair anything. A third German shell screamed overhead and detonated behind them, showering the hull with frozen clods. The commander ordered a shallow zigzag to disrupt the gunner's range finding. The driver obeyed. The Sherman shook violently. The mechanic placed one hand against the metal near the pump. It was warm. Not dangerously hot, warm like a living thing. This was the first test. The improvisation had to prove itself under stress, not in camp, not at idle, but under the brutal strain of acceleration, maneuver, and fear. The platoon behind them spread out according to doctrine. Soviet armor did not duel elegantly. It pressed, supported by artillery, coordinated by dispatches shouted through cold radios. Somewhere, a battery began adjustment fire on suspected German positions. The ground trembled in dull, rhythmic pulses. Yet the Pak-40 still had them. The German gun fired again. This time the shell struck the glacis and ricocheted upward, tearing away a piece of stowage. The shock rippled through the crew's bones. Sokolov did not flinch. He could think only of flow rates, viscosity, and the fragile balance he had created with scrap and felt. The commander gave new orders: advance to the ridge crest, pivot left, suppress the hedge, and allow accompanying infantry to close. The driver advanced carefully. Every meter counted. Every second allowed the Germans to adjust. The engine tone settled into steady strength, deeper, cleaner, confident. The diesel had stopped resisting. It was now cooperating. But the battlefield found new ways to challenge the trick. As the Sherman crested the ridge, the wind shifted. The temperature plunged again. The exposed hull felt the sudden bite of open air. The diesel lines cooled. The pump struggled for a breath. For one terrifying instant, the idle dropped sharply. The crew felt it as if the tank had inhaled ice. Silence threatened. Then the warm shroud released its captured heat. It rolled gently down the metal surfaces, pushing back against the freezing wind. The pump recovered. The engine roared. Sokolov's heart slammed in his chest, but his face remained expressionless. They could move. The commander called for high-explosive rounds. The gunner took aim at the hedge. A plume of earth exploded, and fragments of branches spun through the air. The Pak-40 crew ducked, then scrambled to reload. Panzer grenadiers scattered like shadows. Movement attracted more danger. A Stu-G3 OSV-G revealed itself farther along the tree line, its low silhouette merging with the earth. It rotated its gun slowly, hunting, methodical, patient. German doctrine was simple: let the Soviets rush into killing zones, then finish them. The Sherman had not been built for duels with ambush hunters. It had been built for reliability and cooperation. But reliability required engines to function, and that was Sokolov's battle more than the gunners. The ground beneath the ridge began to soften where sun had touched it earlier. Mud and snow mixed into treacherous paste. The tracks carried clots upward, dripping brown over white. The driver felt drag increase. The engine strained. Increased load meant increased fuel demand. Increased demand meant any obstruction in the pump would reveal itself instantly. Once again, the title problem returned: diesel, cold, and disbelief. The Germans still assumed the Sherman would choke. The Stu-G fired. The shell slammed into the ground short, spraying fragments against the Sherman's side armor. The loader's hands moved faster, fear and discipline blended. The commander shouted coordinates to friendly artillery. Static swallowed half of the message, but it was enough. Sokolov reached toward the shroud again. He pressed his fingertips lightly against it. The metal radiated steady warmth. He could almost picture the fuel inside, thickening, then softening, then flowing without interruption. Air bubbles traveled through lines differently in winter. They turned into pockets. He had designed the duct to discourage those pockets, to keep everything slightly above the freezing threshold. He knew this could fail at any moment. Improvisation was not certainty. It was calculated defiance. The Sherman advanced another 20 meters. The gunner lined up a shot on the hedge again. Another explosion. Screams, faint through the armor. The Pak-40 became silent. Whether destroyed or repositioning, nobody could say yet. The Stu-G fired again. The shell struck the ridge crest behind them, carving a fresh crater, showering the engine deck with shards. One fragment tore through the rear grille and lodged near the duct. Sokolov saw smoke for a moment and smelled something sharp. He reacted instantly, pulling the fragment free with pliers and tossing it aside, then checking the felt insulation. It still held. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. Words wasted oxygen. Actions preserved life. Minutes stretched into long, cold corridors of fear and calculation. Infantry advanced cautiously behind the tanks, slipping through depressions in the snow. Machine guns barked. Artillery shifted its fire further back. The Stu-G retreated, reversing slowly, disciplined to the end. The ridge was theirs. Only then did the commander permit the engine to idle. The crew exhaled at once, as though they had been underwater. But the mission did not end. The Corps had orders to continue toward the pocket. Engines could not rest long. The danger was cumulative, not temporary. Each halt invited cold to creep back into metal. Each restart risked failure. Each kilometer westward pressed deeper into German defenses. That evening, they bivouacked near a windbreak of cracked poplars. The sky glowed with distant fires. Reports arrived. Multiple tanks across the regiment had suffered frozen lines, stalled, and required tows. Several had been lost. Mechanics worked by lantern light, swearing quietly. Officers gathered around maps. They discussed positions, artillery timetables, bridge crossings. Amid the tactical planning, a quieter conversation traveled through the camp. One Sherman had not frozen. One mechanic had done something unusual. Some called it reckless. Others called it clever. Sokolov sat on an ammunition crate, listening to the idling engine, his eyes on the faint vibration of the duct. He did not feel pride. He felt responsibility. If his idea failed tomorrow, everything tonight had only delayed tragedy. He made small adjustments, tightening a strap here, reinforcing felt there. He traced the path of heat with his palm, as if reading a language only he knew. In his small notebook, he wrote a line for the technical report: fuel pump protection achieved by rechanneling engine warmth without open flame. Requires vigilance. Risk acceptable under combat conditions. He did not know whether anyone would read it. The night settled like iron. Somewhere, wolves howled. Somewhere, German patrols moved between frozen hedges. The war did not sleep, and neither did the fear of cold. This was only the beginning of proving whether the diesel, once mocked, could truly become unstoppable, or whether the front would reclaim its due. Dawn came reluctantly, as if unsure whether it wanted to reveal what the night had done. Frost coated the hull in a pale skin. When Sokolov touched the metal, his glove stuck for a second. The air smelled of diesel, smoke, and distant cordite. Orders arrived before breakfast: advance at 7:15, coordinate with infantry, bypass Lysianka, and pressure the German withdrawal routes toward the west. Engines began to start one by one. Some coughed, some roared, some refused. Crews cursed, and lanterns flickered again as mechanics worked furiously. The Sherman with the improvised duct hesitated for a single heartbeat, then the diesel caught, low and uneven, and slowly climbed into steady rhythm. Warmth began to circulate through the funnel. The felt darkened with condensation, then dried. The commander leaned close to Sokolov and said only 3 words: guard the engine. By the time the column formed, the sky had turned a washed-out gray. Snowflakes drifted lazily, the deceptive kind that hit ice beneath powder. The road was not a road anymore, only 2 frozen ruts and a center ridge of compacted snow. Ahead stretched fields broken by tree lines and the faint geometry of abandoned farmsteads. The Germans, sensing the encirclement tightening, had begun to fight differently. They no longer sought decisive engagements. They laid ambushes, delayed, withdrew, then ambushed again. Pack guns appeared in unlikely places, behind barns, in drainage ditches, in the shadows of orchards. Stooges moved like ghosts, appearing only when shots mattered. The Sherman advanced in the second position of the platoon. Sokolov kept one ear on the engine, the other on the radio chatter. Every fluctuation in tone filled him with calculation. Each change forced him to think: heat distribution, pressure, viscosity, airflow. The innovation had become a living system requiring constant attention. By mid-morning, they entered a shallow valley. A stream ran under a broken bridge, half frozen, dark water moving beneath plates of white ice. The lead tank tested the approach. The crossing collapsed into slush, forcing the tanks to skirt along the bank, where mud waded beneath the softening snow. The driver engaged low gear. The tracks dug in. The hull vibrated with loaded effort. The engine demanded more fuel. The pump worked harder. That was when the problem returned with a new face. The fuel lines, though warmed near the pump, still carried sections exposed to wind along the hull interior. As mud splashed upward and froze instantly, an icy crust formed over those lines like armor. Flow slowed. The engine's tone dropped half a register, a dying man's breath. The driver's eyes widened. Sokolov understood. The trick had protected the pump, but the system remained vulnerable elsewhere. Diesel did not care about intentions. It obeyed temperature, pressure, and time. The commander could not stop in the middle of a crossing. To halt meant to sink. To sink meant destruction. German artillery watched all water obstacles. The mechanic acted without asking. He crawled into the cramped engine space while the tank moved, while the hull shuddered and clanged. He braced himself and inspected the lines, feeling with his hands. Cold bit through his gloves. He found the worst section, a bend where the metal collected frost. He pressed against it with his palm, waiting for redistributed warmth from the duct to reach that corner. Outside, rifle fire cracked. The infantry shouted. The Germans had waited for this exact moment, mobility lost, attention divided. A machine gun spat from the trees ahead. Tracers cut pale arcs. Bullets hammered the hull. The crew remained contained within their steel world, listening to the conversation of impacts. The engine stumbled again. Sokolov made a decision that frightened even himself. He loosened the duct slightly so that more heat escaped and drifted further along the lines, sacrificing efficiency near the pump in order to warm the vulnerable sections. Too far, and the pump would cool. Too little, and the lines would still choke. He adjusted with millimeter care, guided not by instruments, but by intuition born of machines and winters. Slowly, grudgingly, the tone improved. The Sherman crawled up the opposite bank, steel shrieking against ice. The mechanic exhaled a breath he had not realized he had been holding. Then the Germans revealed the second layer of the trap. A Pak-40 fired from the flank, hidden behind a collapsed barn. The shell slammed into the soil ahead, throwing mud across the periscope. The commander ordered smoke. Mortars answered. White curtains unfurled, drifting like ghosts. Under that cover, the tanks maneuvered, trading visibility for survival. The Sherman pivoted, treads chewing frozen earth. The engine surged strongly now, fed by warm diesel, defying the expectation that winter would claim it. Through the smoke, faint silhouettes moved, panzer grenadiers with panzerfausts, advancing in short dashes. This was the moment where the trick would either justify itself or lead them to death. The commander shouted for the whole machine gun to suppress the infantry while the main gun sought the barn. The gunner fired high explosive, wood splintered and collapsed. The pack fell silent. But the panzerfausts kept coming. The driver accelerated to deny them close range. Acceleration meant more fuel. More fuel meant more demand. More demand meant any weakness would expose itself. The engine did not falter. Instead, it deepened into a powerful, steady growl, a sound that carried confidence. The Sherman charged forward, crushing frozen fence posts beneath its tracks. One Panzergrenadier loosed his Panzerfaust too early, the projectile hissed past and detonated harmlessly in the snow. Sokolov remained half in the engine compartment, bracing himself, monitoring, adjusting. He had become part of the machinery. He could not see the battlefield. He could only feel it through vibrations, through the language of metal. The platoon spread to support. Another Sherman laid suppressive fire. Infantry closed, firing from the hip, shouting in hoarse voices. The German line buckled and withdrew deeper into the tree line. The hill beyond offered commanding view toward the west. Reaching it would mean securing the crossing and denying the Germans another delaying position. The commander pointed toward it. Advance. The ascent demanded everything the engine could give. The tracks bit, slipped, caught, and climbed. Sokolov listened. Stable. Warm. Flowing. His idea, born from scrap and fear, was working beyond anything he had dared hope. At the crest, the world opened. Smoke columns rose from farms. Black scars marked shell impacts. Across the fields, fleeing vehicles and small groups of German soldiers moved toward distant woods. Artillery began to speak again, this time Soviet. The Sherman halted just long enough to scan sectors. The diesel idled strong, defiant against the cold, as though aware of the mockery it had once received. But victory did not feel like triumph. It felt like exhaustion, like the simple relief of continued motion. Radio reports trickled in throughout the afternoon. Tanks elsewhere had stalled, abandoned, or been destroyed while crews fought their fuel systems. The name, Sokolov, began to circulate quietly. Officers asked what he had done. Mechanics gathered around at brief halts, eyes on the strange duct, hands tracing the felt-wrapped lines. Some nodded in approval. Others frowned in doubt. More than one warned, "This is dangerous." He agreed with all of them. By dusk, the Corps had advanced several kilometers and established new positions. The Sherman took up a hold-down stance behind a low rise. The engine remained on low idle to preserve heat. Sokolov made minor repairs, tightening bolts loosened by the day's violence. He thought about the Germans who had mocked diesel, about the pack gun crews who expected machines to betray their crews. He thought about how close the failure had come, twice, and how thin the line had been between innovation and catastrophe. A courier arrived with instructions: prepare a short technical note for brigade headquarters, detailing the modification. Command wanted to know whether it was repeatable, whether it could be standardized, or whether it was merely luck wrapped in metal. Sokolov looked at his notebook again. His hand trembled slightly, not from cold now, but from the weight of consequence. He wrote slowly, choosing each word with care. The engine idled behind him, steady, alive, and the night listened. Night on the ridge did not bring silence. Artillery rolled somewhere in the distance like approaching thunder, and every few minutes a flare lifted, turning the snow into a brief, unreal daylight. Crews worked in low voices. Radios whispered. Engines idled carefully, the sound of mechanical hearts refusing to freeze. Near midnight, new orders arrived. At 3:40, the platoon would move again, a probing advance toward a village whose name appeared on the map like a smudge. Reconnaissance warned of possible anti-tank positions and at least one Stu-G3 covering the road. The attack was limited, but the risk was real. If the column stalled, the Germans would strike. The commander studied the map under a lantern. He tapped the hull gently, as if addressing the tank itself. We cannot stop. Sokolov felt the weight of that sentence more than the order itself. His improvised duct was no longer merely a clever trick. It had become part of the plan, a small, fragile pillar holding up movement across frozen land. When the time came, they moved out. The road into the village wound between low houses and fruit trees stripped bare by winter. Smoke drifted from chimneys, civilians had long fled, leaving only the shapes of survival. The snow had been churned by wheels and boots, then refrozen into jagged plates. The Sherman shuddered across it. At 3:58, the first shot arrived. A flash from the far end of the street, then a heavy impact slammed into a building beside them, shattering wood and sending splinters across the road. The commander recognized the sound instantly, a stooge firing from hull-down cover. Return fire. Keep moving. But as they pressed forward, the trap revealed itself. A pack gun positioned behind a garden wall opened fire from the right. At the same moment, Panzer Grenadiers emerged from behind sheds, carrying Panzerfausts, moving with disciplined economy. The Germans had shaped a narrow corridor, one entry, one exit, counting on Soviet tanks to halt in confusion. Halting would have meant death. The driver increased throttle. The diesel demanded fuel with sudden urgency. Again, the entire system leaned on the innovation. Heat flowed across the pump, along the lines, pushing back the cold. There was no hesitation this time. The engine responded instantly, confident, unbroken. The commander ordered smoke and he. The main gun fired, and the blast rolled like thunder between walls. A house collapsed inward. Dust billowed. Through it, the stooge fired again, the round skimming the upper hull and vanishing into the darkness beyond. Infantry clung to the sides of the road, advancing in short bursts, shouting targets. A Panzerfaust streaked past the bow, trailing fire, then disappeared into rubble. The pack gun remained. It was positioned to kill stalled tanks, not moving ones. Its crew expected the same weakness the Germans had mocked since the first winter with diesel engines, sluggish starts, frozen lines, machines that refused to answer at the critical moment. Instead, the Sherman closed to within dangerously short range. The gunner fired. The shell struck the wall, and when the dust cleared, the pack lay shattered. The survivors fled. Then the true turning point arrived. From behind the smoke, the stooge attempted to withdraw. It reversed, slow but deliberate, hoping to find a new angle. The commander seized the moment. The Sherman accelerated yet again, climbing a small rise to gain gun depression. Acceleration in the cold was always the moment of truth. Sokolov whispered under his breath, not a prayer, not a plea, simply a request to the engine, as if to a living comrade, hold. It did. The gun fired. The shell struck the stooge at the junction of superstructure and hull, where armor sloped awkwardly. A plume of black smoke burst upward. The German vehicle rolled another meter, then stopped, one final exhalation fading into the frozen air. Silence followed, brief but absolute. The village fell by dawn. Columns continued to push westward with relentless, methodical pressure. Reports filtered in, one Sherman had advanced repeatedly without freezing, even under ambush conditions. Brigade officers summoned Sokolov for questioning. He stood beside the tank, exhausted, uniform stained with oil and soot, while men in long coats examined the duct. They asked how he had conceived the idea. He explained. They asked whether it was safe. He answered carefully, safer than stopping. They asked whether it could be copied. He said yes, but only by men who understood both heat and restraint. In official notes, the innovation was recorded in dry language, field adaptation for diesel reliability in severe cold. Non-standard. Demonstrates initiative. In unofficial talk, a different story spread. German prisoners reportedly said the Shermans should have stalled. Diesel, they insisted, never behaved like that in winter. Some believed the Soviets had installed special heaters. Others said God himself must have warmed the engine. Within the regiment, opinions divided. Some mechanics began building their own versions, cutting ducts from wrecks, wrapping lines in felt, tying everything together with wire. Others refused, calling the trick too dangerous, too close to turning a tank into an oven. And in months that followed, as the front rolled toward Poland, a handful of diaries mentioned the episode. A Sherman in our unit ran for 3 days without freezing. Mechanic altered airflow. Strange method. Worked. Years later, historians would debate it. Some argued the story was exaggerated, that no single field repair could change the course of winter operations. Others insisted the details matched Soviet improvisation perfectly, crude, experimental, effective, born from desperation and intelligence combined. Documents survived, but they were incomplete. The original duct was never preserved. It existed only in photographs that have since disappeared, and in a handful of technical notes written in careful, almost reluctant handwriting. What remained certain was this. In February 1944, near Lysianka, a mechanic refused to accept that diesel must fail in winter. He bent metal around physics, guided by experience rather than doctrine. And for a brief, crucial span of days, the engine that had been mocked became not merely reliable, but unstoppable. The war moved on. Men died. Villages changed hands. Snow melted. Tracks rusted. The duct was eventually removed, replaced by standardized solutions, and forgotten by official histories that prefer clear lines and easy victories. But somewhere in the archive of memory, the story persisted like faint warmth in cold metal. And for us, looking back across time and frost and steel, the lesson is simple. Sometimes survival does not belong to the strongest machine, but to the mind willing to change it when the world seems frozen against it.